A few months ago, I joined Instagram for the first time, which, if you're under 30, probably sounds ridiculous. Somehow, I'd made it this far without it, not because I thought social media was bad, and definitely not because I thought I was above it. I just never found myself thinking, you know what would make today better? Watching strangers eat brunch. So, I stayed away. But then something started bothering me. I've been teaching at college for over a decade. Every semester, new students, new personalities, new strengths, new challenges. And over the years, I've watched thousands of students learn, or at least try to. But recently, something felt different. Not worse, just different. They still cared, they still worked hard, they were curious, they asked thoughtful questions, but somewhere, learning itself seemed to feel different. And I couldn't explain why. So I asked myself a question. What world are my students spending hours in that I know almost nothing about? That's when I finally downloaded Instagram. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Vacation photos, coffee, fitness, weddings, dogs. So many dogs. Then I tapped Reels, one video, then another, a neuroscientist explaining memory in 45 seconds, a physics teacher making quantum mechanics make sense in under a minute, a psychologist, a historian, a language teacher, a mathematician, all competing for the next swipe. That's when I realized I hadn't joined social media. I'd walked into one of the largest classrooms humanity has ever built, and it was open, 24 hours a day, and one question refused to leave my mind. What if social media hasn't changed our ability to learn? What if it's changed what we expect learning to feel like? That question sent me down a rabbit hole, not into social media, into learning itself. Because the more I read, the more I realized something surprising. Learning scientists have been asking a remarkably similar question for decades, and what they discovered completely changed the way I think about education. Here's the strange part. Your brain doesn't actually know whether you've learned something. It only knows what learning feels like. And those two things aren't always the same. Think about the last documentary you watched, or the last book you read, or the last lecture that made perfect sense. While you were watching, everything felt clear. Every idea connected. You thought, I've got this. But then, a week later, how much could you actually explain without looking it up? Psychologists have known about this for years. The feeling of understanding is surprisingly easy to create. Actual understanding is much harder. In cognitive psychology, there's a term for this, the illusion of competence. It's the tendency to mistake familiarity for learning. Every time information feels fluent, your brain interprets that fluency as confidence. But confidence isn't memory, and familiarity isn't understanding, which leads to an uncomfortable possibility. What if the way we measure learning isn't by what we remember, but by how it felt while it was happening? Think about the environment social media creates. Information arrives immediately. Difficult ideas are compressed into seconds. Every explanation is visually engaging. Every moment competes for your attention. Every swipe delivers something new. Learning feels smooth, fast, and effortless. But here's where the science becomes fascinating. Decades of research suggest that the kinds of learning that feel the most effortless are often the least likely to last. Learning researchers even gave this phenomenon the worst names imaginable: desirable difficulties. The idea is surprisingly simple. When your brain has to struggle, retrieve, make mistakes, and reconstruct information, learning often becomes stronger. Which made me wonder something I couldn't stop thinking about. If millions of people now spend hours every day learning in an environment where information feels instant, beautiful, frictionless, and endlessly rewarding, are we quietly teaching ourselves that real learning is supposed to feel that way too? Which made me wonder something even bigger. Maybe this isn't just changing the way we learn. Maybe it's changing what we expect from higher education itself. Because if you ask almost any college or university student today, they'll tell you something their parents probably never could. If I want information, I already know where to find it. That's a remarkable sentence, because for most of history, access to information was one of the primary reasons higher education existed. Universities were places where knowledge lived. Today, knowledge lives almost everywhere, which raises a fascinating question. If students no longer need a university simply to access information, What exactly are they going there for? I don't think the answer is more information. I think it's transformation. Universities don't simply prepare people to remember information. At their best, they prepare people to think independently, solve unfamiliar problems, communicate complex ideas, evaluate evidence, collaborate with people they disagree with, and continue learning long after graduation. Those skills are difficult to compress into a 30-second reel. Not because social media isn't valuable, but because transformation usually takes time. Every day, students watch creators applying knowledge in the real world, building businesses, writing software, diagnosing patients, designing products, and solving practical problems. Learning looks immediate, practical, and useful. And when they walk into a university classroom, it's understandable that many ask, how does today's lecture connect to the life I'm trying to build? Perhaps the challenge facing higher education today isn't convincing students that learning matters. It's making the transformation as visible as the information. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent years teaching, mentoring, and working alongside students, and over that time I had developed my own explanations for what I was seeing in the classroom. But no matter how much experience I had, those explanations were still shaped by my own perspective. And if there was one thing this journey had taught me, it was that assumptions, even well-intentioned ones, are a poor substitute for understanding. If students really are arriving at college and university with different expectations about learning, then I didn't want to guess why. I wanted to find out. The more I looked into the conversations surrounding higher education, the more I noticed something interesting. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Professors had opinions, parents had opinions, employers had opinions. Students had opinions, social media certainly had opinions. But despite all those conversations, one question remained surprisingly unanswered. How do today's students actually experience learning? Because maybe this isn't really a debate about social media. Maybe it isn't even a debate about universities. Maybe it's about understanding what happens when a generation raised in an entirely different learning environment walks into institutions that were designed for a very different world. Neither is necessarily wrong. But if there's a gap between them, I think it's worth understanding. That's why I'm beginning a research project, exploring a question that has stayed with me throughout this journey. Has social media fundamentally changed what students expect learning to feel like? But I'm becoming increasingly convinced that this question naturally leads to another. If those expectations are changing, how can higher education bridge that gap without losing what makes deep learning so valuable? I'm not looking for someone to blame. I'm not trying to prove that one generation is right or another generation is wrong. I'm interested in understanding. Because before we can improve education, before we redesign classrooms, before we rethink teaching, we first have to understand the students sitting in those classrooms. Over the coming months, I'll be speaking with students, collecting data, and exploring these questions through research. And if you're between 17 and 30 years old, I'd love for you to be part of that journey. If you'd like to participate or simply learn more about the project, comment the word research, and I'll send you more information. Because perhaps the future of higher education doesn't begin with better technology, or shorter lectures, or more information. Perhaps it begins with understanding.